At home, the fleet have sailed, the dockyards are empty. Indeed, the government long-term plan is that many of them will stay that way, part of the reduction in our conventional navy. It's been a political row for over a year. It arguably led to a defence minister being replaced and certainly led to the resignation of the Navy minister. In crudest detail, the government want Trident, the technological capability to deal with the Russian threat. And the critics say they are buying Trident at the expense of a vitally needed, but now reduced, surface fleet. It's the Falklands crisis which is putting the argument to the test. A report now from Peter Gill.
On Tyneside, a new British warship, HMS Illustrious, in a hurry to get fitted out. She's a sister ship of the aircraft carrier Invincible, which is leading the task force to the South Atlantic. Illustrious conducted sea trials in January and was due to be completed in the autumn. But that has now been brought forward. The ship's officers have been ordered to get her operational in the next 2 months and then be prepared to sail for the South Atlantic. It's a complex task. All the ship's equipment has to be elaborately tested. Captain Jock Slater, who has already taken command of the Illustrious, receives the latest progress report.
When the ship's at high speed. There are 2 practical proposals, sir, that have been put forward by ship staff and agreed with the local overseers and the ship.
So hurried are the preparations aboard Illustrious that equipment will have to be worked up at sea. We may have assembled an impressive naval response to the Falklands invasion, but it has stretched us to the limit. And the government's critics say that in a few years' time, no such fleet could have been assembled. Britain reckons to maintain a permanent naval presence as far afield as Hong Kong and Belize in Central America. Since the start of the Iran-Iraq War, we've kept a naval force near the Gulf, and another warship is on permanent station in Gibraltar. The school's liner Uganda was cruising in the Mediterranean when she was requisitioned. Instead of sailing back to Britain for a refit, she switched to Gibraltar and in just over 2 days was converted into a hospital ship. The closure of the naval dockyard represents yet another battle to retain the closest possible British links, and Gibraltar tends to win its battles. Against the odds, they've retained full British citizenship. Against the odds, they've withstood 13 years of Spanish blockade. And now they are fighting to keep the naval dockyard open. The government hopes that a naval withdrawal will lead to the yard's commercialisation. But the all-powerful Transport and General Workers Union has vowed to resist the naval pullout. The men's leader is Joe Bassano.
Clearly, if the Ministry of Defence is telling us that Gibraltar's strategic importance is not diminished and that the naval base is very important to them, then, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to make sure that I hit them where it hurts. And that's as far as I'm prepared to go in divulging what I'm going to do. But I can tell you that we will not be restricting ourselves to the naval dockyard, which they want to close. We will be attempting to disrupt everything else in Gibraltar, the whole of Gibraltar.
I think one must look now at what the British government have been doing, sending the Uganda in here for refit, the rumour that the Hermes was coming in for a repair, which would mean that if there are any casualties should the battle take place in the Falklands, it would be quite obvious that the nearest Mediterranean port would be Gibraltar.
Do you think that view is going to convince the government to change its mind on the closures and the rundown?
I think the government have to have another look at the whole situation. And I think in view of the fact that Francis Pym is now the Foreign Secretary and was Minister of Defence, and it is said wasn't very happy about the suggestions of the cutting of the surface fleet, it could well be there'll be another rethink on the policy of the surface fleet.
Anybody, I think, can make policy mistakes, and I think a very major mistake has been made. If Mr. Knott is now prepared to say, yes, all right, we have got it wrong, and the Prime Minister and others, and now, for heaven's sake, let us get it right, I will be the first to cheer, I think.
Do you think the cuts, though, would actually have made any difference to events in the South Atlantic over the last few weeks in terms of the Argentinian move into the Falklands?
Well, I think they might have done insofar as the perceptions of the Argentinians into how serious we are in looking after places like the Falkland Islands, or indeed Gibraltar, or elsewhere. And that is a political perception from their point of view. In terms of actual hardware at the moment, no. I think we are still just on the right side of the cuts. But only just on the right side, because the key thing is not just the disposal of ships, bad though that is. We are beginning to lose the chief petty officers, the junior to middle rank officers, and the skilled teams in the dockyard and support services. And once they've gone, and they are beginning to go now, then of course it's almost impossible to retrieve the situation. So we're, on a knife edge.
Of the Navy's so-called stone frigates, HMS Vernon, the diving and mine warfare school, is to go. The Fraser gunnery range will be closed. The Phoenix Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Warfare School will be moved. And the gunnery school at HMS Excellent will close. Worst of all, for the town, is the loss of 4,500 jobs at the dockyard. But will the Falklands crisis make any difference? Tory leader of the council, John Marshall.
I can only reply that if that doesn't, what the hell will? Ever since last June, the City Council, unions, local MPs, various other bodies have been writing, pressing, arguing, petitioning for the government to change its mind, because in Portsmouth, and now we hope in the nation at large, we believe that there ought to be a strong surface navy.
What sort of response have you had so far from the Ministry of Defence over these last, 7, 8, 9 months?
Oh, completely deadpan. They know it all, they think. Well, perhaps now they understand that they don't know it all.
A Royal Navy hovercraft takes to the water at Leon Solent. The government has just announced this is another unit closing down. The Royal Navy has had the hovercraft operational in one key location, in support of the Marines in the Falkland Islands. So what lessons will be learned from the Falklands debacle? Former head of Naval Intelligence, Captain Roger Villa.
One thing at least will emerge, if it hasn't already, and that is that we do need a navy more than people had realized that we did. And once we realize that, that of itself implies a fairly radical change in policy.
More surface ships?
More surface ships, primarily surface ships. You see, the fact remains that peace is kept by deterrence. And you tend to think of Trident or Polaris, those sort of things, as being the deterrent. It's only one level of deterrent, mighty megatons. The main level of deterrent is keeping the peace in peacetime. And you can do that almost with small sloops armed with popguns.
The latest round of government defence cuts was announced in last year's White Paper, The Way Forward. As the White Paper put it, a rather smaller but modern fleet will give better value for defence resources. Even in the nuclear age, the great names of the Royal Navy live on. On Tyneside, a new Ark Royal takes shape, the fifth in a distinguished line stretching back to the Spanish Armada. She's probably the last of this type to be built. The Ministry of Defence says we'll still be building warships. But the critics see a damaging overall rundown in the surface fleet and a future where we might have been unable to react to a crisis like the Falklands.
I mean, if we are serious about wishing well to our sailors and Marines who are sailing at this minute for the Falkland Islands, the best boost we could give them in the very dangerous task is for the government to announce now that the Navy cuts and the rundown of the Navy is being stopped now, and indeed there will be a reversal.
Of course, if this Falklands operation is a success, the government and the Ministry of Defence will sail on their current course, won't they?
Well, no, if it's a success, it proves that maritime power is needed. And if it's a failure, it proves that if you'd use maritime power in the proper time, with the proper number of ships, then the invasion would never have taken place. So I think either way, the need for maritime power is totally underlined.
Anthony Buck is chairman of the Backbench Conservative Defence Committee and is close to government thinking.
I must keep emphasising that it is intended that the capability and capacity of the Royal Navy in firepower and in doing its major role, which is acting as a deterrent to the Russians, will be and is planned to increase. And now, of course, we shall have to see after this is all over as to what lessons there are to be learned. And it may be that it may cause there to be an expansion of the surface fleet, yes. But let's get it wrong that any suggestion that the Navy was going to be totally emasculated, any suggestion of that is wholly wrong.
Whatever the Falklands fallout in the long term, lessons are already being learnt at Chatham, the naval dockyard that faces closure next year with the loss of 4,500 jobs. The anti-submarine frigate Falmouth is coming out of mothballs. it was just a few months ago that she was put up for disposal by sale or scrap. The Argentinians could have had her for a song. Falmouth will be plugging the gaps left in our own and NATO's defences by the Falklands expedition. There are a dozen warships on the disposal list at Chatham. For the moment, though, the government is sticking to its guns. They remain for sale or scrap. The defence strategy remains the same. The Navy must take its medicine. That was to be the burden of a government defence white paper to be published next week. Publication has now been postponed. The rethink may have started.
Peter Gill, and the argument for a rethink over the government's policy for the Navy.